Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all doing well. As usual, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to click here on another video. Today we're going to be talking about Squid Game, which just came to a close, and I gotta be honest, this is the first time I'm talking about Squid Games here on the channel. It's a series I've wanted to get into for quite some time, but I didn't catch it when it first dropped and it became really popular. I have a bad tendency with a lot of brand new shows to jump on a little bit later because I've been burned so many times in the streaming era of starting a series only for it to get canceled after that first season. So a lot of times I won't dive into a new show that's popping off unless it's part of a franchise I'm already established in, because I just want to see if it'll actually survive. But the downside to that is sometimes I'm behind on coverage, or I just am like out of the loop on something that ends up taking some sort of cultural big moment. And so in the case of Squid Games, that was definitely one of those. And so yeah, I just recently, within the last few weeks, watched the first 2 seasons with my wife in preparation for the 3rd and final season coming. So this video is going to be mainly about the 3rd season and how I felt they wrapped it up, as I think that's most people's kind of, wants and needs in terms of the discussion around Squid Games right now. But I do want to talk a little bit about the 1st and 2nd season, since I've never done anything on Squid Games before, and just kind of share my thoughts. So I will say, if you've seen the first 2 seasons, I will be talking a little bit more openly about the events there and just what I thought. I'm not going to get too deep into it because, again, the 3rd season is what people are most excited about right now. But what I can start this off by saying is that a lot of times with these very popular series, it's, one of those situations where it can be overhyped sometimes by the time you eventually get to it. But in the case of this show, I was so pleasantly surprised by the fact that I really enjoyed this. I found this to be incredible, and in a lot of ways I found it to be a series that very much lived up to the hype, especially that first season, which I do think does a great job of creating great tension, touches on some interesting morality elements, and just touches on the rich and the poor, and uses so much symbolism but very on-the-nose storytelling a lot of times to get that message across. But more than anything, it really introduced interesting characters, put some interesting moral dilemmas at the center of it, kept the drama high, had some unique music and sound effects unique to the show, and just a overall just musical score as well that's unique to the show. The entire tone of the show feels unique to itself, and while it definitely feels like a less gory, more funified version of, or more gamified version I should say, of something like Saw, I found it to be something that felt wholly original in a lot of ways, and again just introduced really interesting elements in its story, and introduced really interesting characters, with of course the main character being the standout of the entire series. But the show has a lot of great characters in here. I will say I may refer to some of the characters in this as their numbers and less so by the characters' actual names and the actors, just because I don't want to sit here and butcher everybody's names, but I will try on a couple of people that I specifically want to talk about. But yeah, I thought the first season was really interesting at introducing the premise of the Squid Games and what's going on, and kind of getting us into the kind of what's going on, but also alongside the characters. I thought they did a great job of having the characters learn information as we go along as well, so you really feel like you're on a journey with the characters. And sometimes with a show or a movie where you're ahead of the characters at times, that's also a good thing, and I think that this show does a great job of giving you enough information at times to make you feel like you're ahead of the actual players that are in the Squid Games. So they're learning information as the story goes on as well, but we as viewers are still learning things alongside them, which keeps things interesting on both fronts. You never feel like you're too ahead of the characters, but you also feel like you're still alongside them. I thought it was really, really solid, and when it came down to this, the way that the first season in particular was really paced, I found myself really impressed by it. So if you've seen the show, then you know that it primarily focuses on the character of player 456, who's played by Jung. Now, I was really excited to see him in this show because I had seen the hype around him for this show, which is I think where he really got blew up in the last few years. But my actual first introduction to him as an actor, really being able to take him in a whole story or show, was Star Wars The Acolyte, which of course is not a show that gets a whole lot of fantastic reviews. I was more positive on it than most, but I also said it was my least favorite of the Star Wars shows they've recently put out. But he was easily a standout of that show for me. I really enjoyed his performance. I thought he brought a very Jedi vibe to that show. So I was excited to step into something completely different, but also see the thing that most people hype him up about. And I thought he did an incredible job as this character here, who when we meet him is, struggling with gambling debts, and he's not necessarily the best father because of these addictions he has to gambling and just wasting his money. He's made a lot of poor choices, which has left not only him, but his mother in a tight spot, and of course has ruined his relationship relationship with his ex-wife and now his daughter, who wants to be in his life, but he isn't necessarily stepping up in all the right ways. And so he's an interesting character to have go into this whole Squid Game thing, because he wants to make money so that he can pay off his debts, but also care for his mom and care for his daughter. And he's got this ambition about him. And once he gets in there, you know, while he, just like everybody else, has morally gray areas and morally gray choices they have to make amidst the things that are going on, I thought he was just a really interesting character to throw in the mix here, because he is able to be that moral compass for majority of the viewers and just for the characters around him. He's also to be capable of being, you know, like I said, morally gray, but he's also a character who is endearing and fun to watch at times too. There's a charm to him. I think that Lee Jung-jae does a great job of creating a character that feels likable and lovable. You can really see a lot behind his eyes that I think really comes down to how good he is as an actor to really sell us on a character that feels complex in a lot of ways. And, you know, you really feel for his journey throughout the entirety of that first season. And I thought that the first season did a great job of having a mix of characters. You have the guy who's like the big tough bad guy who's clearly there for selfish reasons, and there's other people in the mix like that. There's a lot of throwaway characters or players that are just mainly there to be fodder to the games and die, you know, as things go on. But you had, you know, a mix of different kind of characters and personalities, characters that you were fearful for, characters that you think maybe are going to make it further than they do. There's characters that are just flat out annoying, and it keeps everything engaging, interesting. And of course, one of the big key players in the first one is player one, who of course ends up being the actual man behind Squid Games the whole time, which I thought was a really cool twist. I started to figure out that was happening as we got later into the show, but I found him to be a really great element. And just overall, I thought the first season was great. I liked the way it wrapped up. For me, it was a really tight season of television. A little bit of a strange choice, but though I get it, I suppose, with our main character 456 dyeing his hair like that hot pink or like bright red. It was a little distracting of a way to end the show, but yeah, I was really torn though with the way that the show ended, with him essentially wanting to go back to the Squid Games, you know, because he wanted to try to end the games after everything he went through in the first season, and having to, of course, kill off friends or, you know, lose friends in there, make poor choices to hurt people. He never wanted that to happen to anybody else again. So though he comes out with all the money, he's torn morally on what to do. And on one hand, I really appreciate that drive that brings him into the events of the second season. But at the same time, you know, with so much of that first season revolving around him wanting to be a better father and being able to get this money so that he can make life for his daughter. Unfortunately, of course, his mom does pass away while he's dealing with all this, and he was never really, you know, present. And that the show has something to say about that too, and we're going to get into it in just a moment. But I was a little torn on the fact that he was kind of just essentially throwing away the portion of like going to be a better father and kind of reconnect with his daughter. That is something that in a lot of ways is just kind of thrown to the wayside in the series. It doesn't necessarily feel like something that they focus on even much in the second and third season. So that was a bit of a bummer. They do enough to give you explanation around his motivation. But yeah, that was a frustrating part. Now, before we get into season 2, I think one thing I want to talk about in terms of this show in general is the way that it talks about the rich and the poor, because this is a show that, of course, on the nose element really is about how a lot of times we at the bottom, you know, people in the middle class or lower class, or the, you know, the middle lower class, whatever, are just fighting for scraps, while there's this, you know, small group of individuals at the top who have like all the money in the world, you know. And it's one of those situations where, yeah, you know, a lot of those people are the ones making the choices that end up kind of creating issues, creating fights, creating a chase for that money in a way that, you know, ends up just kind of dividing people and causing problems in certain low income areas, you know, just where you see a lot of violence and a lot of just prejudice and just a lot of, you know, all kinds of different crime in general. And that there's definitely a systematic element to it. And this show not only showcases that through the fact that you have these people at the top running the Squid Games, and then the VIPs who come into play a factor at a certain point that, of course, are the absolute, you know, representation of like the 1%, so to speak. You know, I thought that what made this really interesting as well is that you also just have these characters in more dilemmas, where you even have characters who are likable, good people who eventually find themselves making selfish poor choices or malicious choices simply because there is kind of money being hung in front of them. And so even characters that are fearful for their lives, begging for their lives, that at one point are willing to do anything they can to continue to push themselves forward, even if somebody else helped them at a certain point. And I think it, unfortunately kind of speaks to humanity in a lot of ways. Humanity is complex, and humans are a lot of things, which the human are element of the way that this season moves forward, the third season is an interesting part. But yeah, I thought that this really spoke to the unfortunate side of humanity and how a lot of times even the best people can be pushed to terrible things, or at least temptation of terrible things, when it comes down to feeling like they have to protect themselves, whether it be monetarily or violence wise. But in the case of this, it just goes to show how a lot of times if you're in the way of somebody who is desperate enough and the right incentive is put in front of them, it creates this ability to turn on one another. And I thought that this show tackled that really well. Now, the second season was a season of television that I was kind of disappointed to hear from people who had seen it, that they said it wasn't as good as the first season. And while I do agree, if you look at it as an individual season, I do think it is a situation where I don't think it's necessarily fair to judge the second season on the same level that you do the first season. Now, some people might say why, but for me, I would honestly say it has more to do with the fact that I think that first season was meant to tell a complete story and leave you in a place where there is more possibility for story, but not necessarily in a place where it feels like it's, completely leaving you in the dark. It has a complete beginning, middle, and end, and it comes to a place that wraps up the story and teases more, but feels complete. With the second season, it's clearly built to not be a complete story. It ends halfway through the story, halfway through the games, whereas the entirety of the Squid Games is played throughout that first season. The second season literally cuts you halfway in the middle of a big moment in the show. And so I don't necessarily know that it's fair. I can understand the gripe of not feeling like you got a complete story, but with the way that they wrapped it up with season 3 now, I do think that having that complete picture of the second and third season for people who can binge through it no problem, I think they did a pretty solid job there of keeping things interesting and leaving you in a place where you're excited to see what happened. Now, with that said, I just watched this show over the course of the last few weeks, so I didn't have the couple of years to wait that many did after season 2 ended, where it just feels like you were left in the middle of some high tension stuff. So I do understand the criticism, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's necessarily one for one. I think that the second season honestly employs a lot of the same top tier storytelling that the first season had, and had a lot of really interesting elements that keep you engaged throughout. That's one great thing about this show, is that I honestly never found myself bored, and I do wish the second and third season had a few more episodes, but that's also part of why I don't necessarily feel like it's one for one in terms of comparisons, because second season is also shorter than the first season, and so is the third season, which I believe is shorter than the second season. And so it's a different way to tell the story across 2 seasons. And I think when I look at the second and third season and how they wrapped it up, well, I have a couple of gripes about how certain storylines ended up. I do think for the most part that season 3 did a great job of kind of bringing it all together and introducing some interesting characters in the mix, though there are some cringe ones in there as well, like the character of Thanos and just his posse of miscreants, if you will. But I did like a lot of the characters they introduced in the second season as well. I really liked the trans character. I thought that she was a great element, just a great vulnerable human character in the mix. I really enjoyed the performance there as well from the actor. And I really loved the mom and son dynamic as well. While the son is a little bit of a frustrating and annoying kind of wimpy character, the mom was a great part of that entire thing. And again, 2 great actors that I thought brought a lot of nuance to their roles. And it was interesting to see a mother and son in these high stakes environments. And of course, another big player in season 2 into 3 was player 222, who of course, he was a pregnant character, which was another interesting dynamic to have in the mix. So I think with all of that and having the head guy pretend to be number 1 again, I just think overall the second and third season introduced some really interesting characters, played off of some great characters, and there's a lot of other faces in the mix that it would take me way too long to mention all of them here. But yeah, moving into my non-spoiler thoughts on the third season to kind of wrap this up, because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. I think for the most part that this show really did a great job of wrapping up the storylines and bringing this version of Squid Game to a close. Now, I say this version because the show does kind of tease pretty much that there is going to be more Squid Games, perhaps just not in Korea and not focusing on these characters. But I do think for the most part, the performances are all really well handled. Again, the games we spend time with in the third season, I thought were really fun and kind of put things in a very scary perspective for our characters. You know, just like the first season and the second season, there are unfortunately characters that are super likable that start to perish as time goes on. And I think that this show, again, utilizes a lot of these moments to really showcase, you know, how morally gray these areas are sometimes, how these characters are pushed to do things that they would never do for the sake of, you know, keeping their humanity, or just for the characters that flat out lose their humanity. How money and how desperation can change who we are, even the most kind-hearted characters, and how there are people who will make you believe they are one thing to just ultimately prove in the end that they are the complete opposite. I think all of that was handled well with the various characters that we had. I do think across the second and third season, there was maybe too many characters we focused on. You know, like I mentioned in the first season, there's a lot of fodder, but they focused on enough characters that are part of that first season that are like kind of integral faces to the storyline. They focus on enough that keep them engaging, but they don't necessarily, you know, focus on every single character. Some characters might have a couple lines here and there, but for the most part, there's a lot of fodder to kind of just be shed off. And I think that the second and third season, while I had a lot of fodder to shed off as well, there was a lot more characters they focused on, and characters that would be a part of a few episodes and then end up getting kind of offed. And then there was some characters that were the big faces across the second and third season. And while I enjoyed most of them, and I thought that they all kind of played their role well, there was probably a handful that just felt like there was too many. And I think at times that pulled things back just a little bit from the focus on the characters I found to be the most dynamic, because there's also characters that are amidst the bad guys that are also having their own plot points as well. And while I enjoyed those storylines, again, it just was maybe a part where I'm like, maybe this isn't as interesting as this, or, you know, vice versa. So it's one of those situations where I do think it, for the most part, all of it's well handled and well acted, but there's also a part of me that maybe thinks like, we could have kind of trimmed down a few storylines. Now, one character that I think in the mix and their storyline is going to maybe not work for everybody is the character of Gi-hun, which is played by Hwang Jun-ho. He was the detective character in the mix who, of course, we learn at the end of the first season, his brother that he's been looking for that went missing was actually the guy in the black mask who's running the Squid Game. So, you know, the whole rest of the second and third season, he's on this boat trying to find the island that he was on at one point to try to find his brother, stop his brother. And I just felt like his story was a lot of stopping and starting. There was interesting developments, and the side characters that are a part of that subplot, you know, they do some interesting things to kind of keep it engaging. But by the time we get to the end of the show, it feels like that storyline kind of fizzles out in a way that doesn't ever really give it any deep closure, which was a bummer. But I do think they do some really interesting things with his brother character, the guy who runs everything, In-ho, who's played by Lee Byung-hun. I thought that he was really great in the show. I thought his performance was really nuanced, and I liked kind of seeing that, you know, morally gray, again, relationship he was building with our main character 456. I thought that that was an interesting element, and even him as the orchestrator of the games to find himself kind of struggling, because I think the show has not only to do with money and the rich and the poor, but also has to do with faith in humanity and the choices they'll make amidst even darkness. And while there's a lot of darkness and a lot of poor choices being made here by all of the characters, I think that it was interesting to see In-ho kind of go through some character development himself as the guy who's running this horrible game thing. And just overall, man, you know, to bring this to a close, I thought that the show was a lot of fun. I thought it came to a pretty solid close while setting things up, so it's not necessarily a full bow on top ending. But I do think they made some interesting choices that are either going to work for some or not work for others. And how they chose to end 456's story is something that I both appreciate. I think his character does come full circle, but like I mentioned before, with the whole narrative of the first season being about him trying to save his daughter, I don't necessarily know that I feel fully satisfied in how they ended his story, though I do appreciate how they chose to end his story, because I think it says a lot about where his character came from and where his character ended up. And I do think there's an element to the end of the show that is going to rub some people the wrong way or not. But outside of that, I will say that I think this is a very strong piece of television. These 3 seasons, it's tense, it's got tons of drama, it's got a lot of interesting characters. The characters are put in morally kind of, you know, tough dilemmas. There's some great commentary about rich, poor, desperation, and all those different things, humanity, the faith in humanity, what it is to be be human. I thought all of that was really well done. And then in terms of production design and set design and locations, while there is some green screen use for sure in areas where the characters are in high places or maybe out in the water or doing different things, I think for the most part, this is a show that looks really good. The costume design, the set design, it all feels unique and kind of specific to this franchise, to this series. I thought that the overall aesthetic of it in terms of the blood and stuff like that, while not overly gory, is all done really well in terms of the practical effects. There's a lot of blood squibs and different things like that. You know, not a lot of CGI blood. While there's some CGI blood, there's not an abundance of it. So I honestly love the fact that the show really maintained a lot of practical effects and just a lot of in-camera stuff. The costume design, everything. There's so much about it in its sounds and in its music and in its look that just feels so unique. And in a world where we have so many things that feel samey to one another, Squid Game is something that I think, you know, I totally get why it popped off. I get why so many people enjoyed it, and I'm happy to have finally seen the show. I'm sad to see this iteration of the story go, and I do think that there was elements about season 3 that could have wrapped up certain characters that are big storylines from the first season. I think that there were certain storylines they could have wrapped up a little bit better, but I do think they do a good job of putting a bow on top, bringing things to an end, and you know, again, utilizing the show to get a message across about, you know, we as humans in a lot of ways, while also setting up for possible more in the franchise. So that's going to be my long rambly review here on the Squid Game series in general and how I feel it wrapped up. Curious to hear what you guys have to say. Did you like the season? Did you not like the season? Are you sad to see the show go? Are you excited for where this franchise is going? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.